This is one of the reasons I'm so in love with Shopify as the flagship application for Ruby on Rails. Shopify exists at a scale that most programmers will never touch. On Black Friday, I think Shopify did 1 million requests per second. That's not 1 million requests of images. That's of dynamic requests that are funneling through the pipeline of commerce. I mean, Shopify runs something like 30% of all e-commerce stores on the damn internet. A huge portion of all commerce in total runs through Shopify, and that runs on Ruby on Rails. So Ruby on Rails is able to scale up to that level without using static typing in all of what it does. Now, I know they've done certain experiments in certain ways because they are hitting some of the limits that you will hit with dynamic typing. And some of those limits you hit with dynamic typing are actually, by the way, just limits you hit when you write 5 million lines of code. I think the Shopify monolith is about 5 million lines of code. At that scale, everything breaks because you're at the frontier of what humans are capable of doing with programming languages. The difference in part is that Ruby is such a succinct language that those 5 million, if they'd been written in, let's just say, Go or Java, would have been 50 or 25. Now, that might have alleviated some of the problems that you have when you work on huge systems with many programmers, but it certainly would also have compounded them. Try to understand 25 million lines of code.
So the thing does scale. That's a persistent myth that it doesn't scale. Shopify and others, but Shopify I think is a great example. By the way, I love Shopify and I love Toby.
You got to have Toby on.
Yeah,
just talked
for sure.
to him this morning.
For sure. He's a brilliant... I got to hang out with him in the desert somewhere, I forget, in Utah. He's just a brilliant human. And Shopify.com/Lex has been supporting this podcast for the longest time. I don't think actually Toby knows that they sponsor this podcast. I mean, it's a big company, right?
It's a huge company. I think just under 10,000 employees, market cap of $120 billion, GMV of $250 billion every quarter.
And he's involved with the details still.
He is, very much so. A funny story about Toby. Toby was on the Rails core team back in the mid-2000s. Toby himself wrote Active Merchant, which is one of the frameworks for creating shops. He wrote the Liquid templating language that Shopify still uses to this day. He has a huge list of contributions to the Rails ecosystem, and he's the CEO of the company. I think it's very inspiring to me because it's such at the opposite end of what I like to do. I like to chisel code with my own hands most of the day. He runs a company of almost 10,000 people that is literally like world commerce depends on it. A level of criticality I can't even begin to understand. And yet we can see eye to eye on so many of these fundamental questions in computer science and program development. That is a dynamic range. To be able to encompass Rails being a great tool for the one developer who's just starting out with an idea, who don't even fully know everything, who is right at the level where PHP would have been a good fit in those late 90s because, I could probably upload something to an FTP server and so on. Rails does have more complexity than that, but it also has so much longer runway. The runway goes all the way to goddamn Shopify. That is about the most convincing argument I can make for sort of dynamic range that we can do a lot of it. And even having said that, Shopify is the outlier, of course. I don't think about Shopify as the primary target when I write Rails. I think of the single developer. Actually, I do think about Shopify, but I don't think about Shopify now. I think of Shopify when Toby was writing Snow Devil, which was the first e-commerce store to sell snowboards that he created. That was the pre-Shopify. He created all by himself. And that was possible because Ruby on Rails isn't just about beautiful code. It's just as much about productivity. It's just as much about the impact that an individual programmer is able to have. That they can build a system where they can keep the whole thing in their head and be able to move it forward such that you can go from one developer sitting and working on something, and that something is Shopify, and it turns into what it is today. When we talk about programming languages and we compare them, we often compare them at a very late stage. Like, what is the better programming language for, let's say, Twitter? in 2009 when it's already a huge success. Twitter was started on Ruby on Rails. They then hit some scaling problems. It was a big debacle at the time. They end up then, I think, writing it in some other language, which, by the way, I think is the best advertisement ever for Ruby on Rails, because nothing fucking happened for 10 years after they switched over, right? Essentially zero innovation. Some of that was because they were doing a long conversion, and all of the early success in part came because they had the agility to quickly change and adopt and so forth. That's what startups need. That's what Shopify needed. That's what Twitter needed. That's what everyone needs. And that's the number one priority for Ruby on Rails, to make sure that we don't lose that. Because what happens so often when development tools and programming language are driven by huge companies is that they mirror their org chart. React and everything else needed to use that is in some ways a reflection of how Meta builds Facebook. Because of course it is. Because of course it's an distraction of that. I'm not saying React isn't a great tool and that can't be used by smaller teams. Of course it can. But it's born in a very different context than something like Ruby on Rails.
Let me say as a small aside, because I think we might return to Shopify and celebrate it often. Just a sort of personal note. This particular podcast has way more sponsors and sponsors that want to be sponsors than I could possibly ever have. And it's really, really important for me to not give a shit and to be able to celebrate people. Like, I celebrate people, I celebrate companies. And I don't care that they're sponsoring. I really don't care. I just want to make that very explicit because we're going to continue saying positive things about Shopify. I don't care. Stop sponsoring. It doesn't really matter to me. But yeah, I just want to make that explicit. So, but to linger on the scaling thing with the Twitter and the Shopify, can you just explain to me what Shopify is doing with the JIT? What did they have to try to do to scale this thing? Because that's kind of an incredible story, right?
Yeah. So one of the great contributions that Shopify has made to the entire Ruby ecosystem, not just Rails, but in particular Rails, is YJIT. So YJIT is their compiler for Ruby that just makes everything a lot more efficient. And at Shopify scale, eking out even a 5-10% improvement in Ruby's overhead and execution time is a huge deal. Now, Shopify didn't need YJIT. Shopify was already running on the initial version of Ruby that was, I think, 10 times slower than what we have today. If you look back upon the Ruby 1.8.6 that Toby probably started on, just as I started on. And that was enough to propel Shopify to the scale that it has today. A lot of the scaling conversation is lost in a failure to distinguish two things. Scale is kind of one package we talk about when there are really multiple packages inside of it. One is runtime performance, latency. How fast can you execute a single request? Can it happen fast enough that the user will not notice? If your Rails request takes 1.5 seconds to execute, the user's going to notice. Your app is going to feel slow and sluggish. You have to get that response time down below, let's say, at least 300 milliseconds. I like to target 100 milliseconds as my latency. That's kind of performance. How much performance of that kind of latency can you squeeze out of a single CPU core? That tells you something about what the price of a single request will be. But then whether you can deal with 1 million requests a second, like Shopify is doing right now, if you have one box that can do 1,000 requests a second, you just need X boxes to get up to 1 million. And what you'll actually find is that when it comes to programming languages, they're all the same in this way. They all scale largely, beautifully horizontally. You just add more boxes. The hard parts of scaling a Shopify is typically not the programming language. It's the database. And that's actually one of the challenges that Shopify has now is how do you deal with MySQL at the scale that they're operating at? When do you need to move to other databases to get worldwide performance? All of these things. The questions about scaling Ruby are economic questions. If we're spending so and so much on application servers, if we can get just 5% more performance out of Ruby, well, we could save 5% of those servers, and that could filter down into the budget. Now, that analysis concludes into basically one thing. Ruby is a luxury language. It's a luxury, the highest luxury, in my opinion. It is the Coco Chanel of programming languages, something that not everyone can afford. And I mean this in the best possible way. There are some applications on the internet where each request has so little value, you can't afford to use a luxurious language like Ruby to program in it. You simply have to slum it with a C or a Go or some other low-level language or a Rust. Talk about line noise there
That's
for a
like
hot second.
the thrift store of languages.
Exactly. Where you need you need a very low level to do it. You can't afford to use a luxury language to build it with. That's not true of Shopify. It wasn't true of Basecamp even back in 2004. It's not been true of 99% of all web applications ever created, because the main cost component of 99% of web applications is not CPU cores. It's wet cores. It's human cores. It's human capacity to understand and involve systems. It's their personal productivity. I did a calculation once when someone had, for the 400th time, said that, if you switch from Ruby to some faster language, you could save a bunch of money. And I calculated it out that at the time, and I think the last time I did this calculation was almost a decade ago, we were spending about 15% of our operating budget on Ruby application servers. So for me to improve my cost profile of the business by 7 percentage points, I'd have to pick something twice as fast. That's quite hard. Versus if Ruby on Rails was even 10% more productive than something else, I would move the needle far more, because making individual programmers more productive actually matters a lot more. This is why people are so excited about AI. This is why they're freaking out over the fact that a single programmer in Silicon Valley who makes $300,000 a year can now do the work of 3 or 5, at least in theory. I haven't actually seen that fully in practice, but let's just assume the theory is correct. If not now, then in 6 months. That's a huge deal. That matters so much more than whether you can squeeze a few more cycles out of the CPU when it comes to these kinds of business applications. If you're making Unreal Engine rendering stuff like Tim Sweeney you had on, he needs to really sweat all those details. The Nanite engine can't run on Ruby. It's never going to. It was not meant for that. Fine. These kinds of business applications absolutely can. And everything that people are excited about AI for right now, that extra capacity to just do more, that was why we were excited about Ruby back in the early 2000s. That was because I saw that if we could even squeeze out a 10% improvement of the human programmer, we'd be able to do so much more for so much less.